Good evening. Welcome. I first of all want to thank you for coming to this breakout session on the alleged parallels concerning Jesus and pagan religions. I am honored that you would come here. There are so many other great breakout sessions going on right now, and I encourage you to get around to as many of those as you can while you attend the conference here. There's some really, really great speakers here, and I'm just pleased you decided to come to this one. I have one just basic caveat before I begin. I'm going to be covering a lot of information tonight on this movie called the Zeitgeist movie. How many people here have seen the movie? Oh, good. So a number of you are familiar with it. Great. We're going to actually watch a little bit of it tonight. Small film clip from it. I'm going to be covering a lot of information here, and because I'm going to cover a lot in a very short period of time, I'm concentrating on breadth rather than depth. And so I want to encourage you to look more into this. The sources that I list on the back of my handout there are great sources to start with that I recommend highly to you. There are other sources as well that you can go to, but those are good ones to start with there and do some serious looking into this particular issue. I also want to comment here real quickly that one of the reasons I think that this movie has become so popular and that many Christians have questioned their own beliefs and faiths concerning this movie is because of the cultural setting we're in right now with the internet. The internet, which is the major way this movie has been passed around. Okay, the internet is a great tool, and I love it. I do a lot of research off the internet. We all do, okay, at that particular point. But it's also a very dangerous tool if mishandled or abused. And the internet has made it possible basically for anybody to post literally anything they want to on there. And because it's posted and it's published, there's a tendency among some people to think, well, it must be the truth or there must be something to this because that wouldn't have been posted if there wasn't. And I want to say that be very, very, very cautious about hearing things on the internet or reading things on the internet. You know, check that out. Make sure you look into it. Do the serious scholarship that's involved in that. Don't just simply buy into that, because oftentimes that I find that's what's happened here. A couple of semesters ago, I was teaching in one of my classes, and after the class, I had a student come up to me and say to me, Dr. Foreman, can I come to your office and talk to you? I'm having some serious doubts about my Christian faith. So I said, sure, just come on by. So he came by my office, we sat down and we talked, and he started to share with me. He said, well, I've come from a Christian home, I was raised in that, and I went to a good Christian church, and I thought I really believed in what Christianity teaches concerning the person of Jesus Christ, what he said and what he did. And then recently I saw this movie. And I can't tell you how often I hear that phrase. I saw this movie, okay, on the internet called Zeitgeist. And this movie challenged the traditional things that I believed about Jesus Christ. And now I'm beginning to wonder, is that stuff really true or not? Is this what this movie claims? Is this, in fact, really the case? Well, at that time, I hadn't seen the movie. I had heard something but wasn't really aware of it. So I went online and I checked it out and I watched the movie and saw immediately something that I had seen before. Okay, and I'm going to explain that in a minute, what I mean by having seen it before. Okay, but saw that movie and realized this is something that's causing good Christians to suddenly begin to doubt Christianity. A lot of people have bought into this particular picture. One of the reasons why is the movie is a very slickly made movie. Well, what exactly is the Zeitgeist movie? Okay. Well, Zeitgeist literally means spirit of the age. That's the name of the movie that the name was selected to pick from. And by the way, it's always in capital letters whenever it's talked about, Zeitgeist movie. It's a movie that was produced by Peter Joseph. That's not his real name. It's a pseudonym that he used when he produced this particular movie. It was released online in June of 2007. And just within a few weeks of it being released, within 3 weeks, it already had 50 million viewers viewed the film. Okay, it had a huge impact on a number of people here. Skeptics loved it. Many skeptics loved it, I should say. Not all skeptics. Some skeptics were very critical of it. But many skeptics loved the movie because it supported their view, of course, that Christianity is not true, okay, that it's a fictional account. Many Christians became very doubtful of their faith because of what they'd seen in this particular movie. Now, what exactly is it? Well, it's a 2-hour documentary conspiracy theory film which attempts to show a connection between 3 alleged frauds, so the film claims, foisted on mankind. The first of these is Christianity. The basic Christian story is a fraud. It's a myth. It's not really true. The second one was that the terrorist attacks of 9/11 were really government-sponsored attacks. And the last part of it was the domination of world events by international bankers. That, in fact, everything that's happening in the world is a conspiracy of international bankers. Now, this is a conspiracy theory film. And those of you who may or may not be familiar with this, conspiracy theory films make a lot of very broad, very large assertions, okay, for which they think they have evidence, okay, and they produce that in this particular film here. It's very slickly made. It's weird to watch, I should warn you. The first 10 minutes of it is just a lot of chaotic stuff going on. Well, maybe not 10 minutes, but about 7 or so minutes of it is a lot of chaotic stuff go on. We're not going to talk about the whole film. That's not my purpose here. I only want to talk about the first part of it, the part about Christianity. And even then, I'm only going to talk about a small section of that part that's here. I think the best thing to do here is to show you a clip here. But basically, the thesis of the film is this. Jesus Christ never existed. He is just a Jewish version of an ancient pagan mystery religion based on sun worship, okay? That's called astrotheology, the idea of sun worship, or worshiping astrology, in a sense, a combination of astrology and theology. And the film is basically about that. What I'd like to do, in order for us to understand what's going on, is play for you a small 7-minute clip from the film, okay, so you can kind of see. So I'm picking up, not quite at the beginning of the film, but pretty close to the beginning of the film, for you to watch this clip. And we might want to bring these lights down a little bit so you can see it well up here on the screen, okay? And
this is the sun.
Make sure our volume's up here so we can
hear that.
As
far back as 10,000 BC, history is abundant with carvings and writings reflecting people's respect and adoration for this object. And it is simple to understand why, as every morning the sun would rise, bringing vision, warmth, and security, saving man from the cold, blind, predator-filled darkness of night. Without it, the cultures understood the crops would not grow and life on the planet would not survive. These realities made the sun the most adorned object of all time. Likewise, they were also very aware of the stars. The tracking of the stars allowed them to recognize and anticipate events which occurred over long periods of time, such as eclipses and full moons. They in turn cataloged celestial groups into what we know today as constellations. This is the cross of the zodiac, one of the oldest conceptual images in human history. It reflects the sun as it figuratively passes through the 12 major constellations over the course of a year. It also reflects the 12 months of the year, the 4 seasons, and the solstices and equinoxes. The term zodiac relates to the fact that constellations were anthropomorphized or personified as figures or animals. In other words, the early civilizations did not just follow the sun and stars, they personified them with elaborate myths involving their movements and relationships. The sun, with its life-giving and saving qualities, was personified as a representative of the unseen creator or God, God's Son, the light of the world, the savior of humankind. Likewise, the 12 constellations represented places of travel for God's Son, and were identified by names, usually representing elements of nature that happened during that period of time. For example, Aquarius, the water bearer, who brings the spring rains. This is Horus. He is the sun god of Egypt of around 3000 BC. He is the sun anthropomorphized, and his life is a series of allegorical myths involving the sun's movement in the sky. From the ancient hieroglyphics in Egypt, we know much about this solar messiah. For instance, Horus, being the sun or the light, had an enemy known as Set, and Set was the personification of the darkness or night. And, metaphorically speaking, every morning Horus would win the battle against Set, while in the evening Set would conquer Horus and send him into the underworld. It is important to note that dark versus light, or good versus evil, is one of the most ubiquitous mythological dualities ever known, and is still expressed on many levels to this day. Broadly speaking, the story of Horus is as follows. Horus was born on December 25th of the Virgin Isis Mary. His birth was accompanied by a star in the east, which, in turn, 3 kings followed to locate and adorn the newborn Savior. At the age of 12, he was a prodigal child teacher, and at the age of 30, he was baptized by a figure known as Anup, and thus began his ministry. Horus had 12 disciples he traveled about with, performing miracles such as healing the sick and walking on water. Horus was known by many gestural names such as the Truth, the Light, God's Anointed Son, the Good Shepherd, the Lamb of God, and many others. After being betrayed by Typhon, Horus was crucified, buried for 3 days, and thus resurrected. These attributes of Horus, whether original or not, seem to permeate many cultures of the world, for many other gods are found to have the same general mythological structure. Attis of Phrygia, born of the Virgin Nana on December 25th, crucified, placed in a tomb, and after 3 days was resurrected. Krishna of India, born of the Virgin Devaki, with a star in the east signaling his coming. He performed miracles with his disciples, and upon his death was resurrected. Dionysius of Greece, born of a virgin on December 25th, was a traveling teacher who performed miracles such as turning water into wine. He was referred to as the King of Kings, God's only begotten Son, the Alpha and Omega, and many others. And upon his death, he was resurrected. Mithra of Persia, born of a virgin on December 25th, he had 12 disciples and performed miracles, and upon his death was buried for 3 days and thus resurrected. He was also referred to as the Truth, the Light, and many others. Interestingly, the sacred day of worship of Mithra was Sunday. The fact of the matter is, there are numerous saviors from different periods from all over the world which subscribe to these general characteristics. The question remains, why these attributes? Why the virgin birth on December 25th? Why dead for 3 days in the inevitable resurrection? Why 12 disciples or followers? To find out, let's examine the most recent of the solar messiahs. Jesus Christ was born of the Virgin Mary on December 25th in Bethlehem. His birth was announced by a star in the east, which 3 kings or magi followed to locate and adorn the new Savior. He was a child teacher at 12, and at the age of 30 he was baptized by John the Baptist, and thus began his ministry. Jesus had 12 disciples, which he traveled about with, performing miracles such as healing the sick, walking on water, raising the dead. He was also known as the King of Kings, the Son of God, the Light of the World, the Alpha and Omega, the Lamb of God, and many, many others. After being betrayed by his disciple Judas and sold for 30 pieces of silver, he was crucified, placed in a tomb, and after 3 days was resurrected and ascended into heaven. First of all, the birth sequence is completely astrological. The star in the east is Sirius, the brightest star in the night sky, which, on December 24th, aligns with the 3 brightest stars in Orion's belt. These 3 bright stars in Orion's belt are called today what they were called in ancient times, the 3 kings. And the 3 kings and the brightest star, Sirius, all point to the place of the sunrise on December 25th. This is why the 3 kings follow the star in the east, in order to locate the sunrise, the birth of the sun.
Impressive. Very slickly made, very nicely made. By the way, just one quick comment here. One of the first things when I saw this film that immediately let me know that there's some serious errors in it is his mistake in astronomy. If anybody here knows a little bit about astronomy, his claim, for example, that Sirius follows the 3 stars, the 3 kings that are in Orion's belt, they on December 25th, they align that way. Folks, they align that way every night. Okay, there's nothing special that happens on December 25th. You can go out tonight, Orion's in the sky, you will see align them just that way, and it's we're not near December 25th at that particular point. That happens every single night. Also, by the way, you'll notice that he says on December 25th that these 3 stars in Sirius point to the sunrise. Okay, that would mean that, of course, Orion would have to be in the eastern part of the sky around sunrise on the December 25th. But Orion is a winter constellation. Orion, being in its winter constellation, that means that starting around the time of the winter, around late October, it begins to rise on the horizon. By December, at midnight, Orion is straight up in the sky. Now, if Orion is straight up in the sky at midnight in December, where's Orion at sunrise on that day? Orion's over in the west. It's nowhere near the east. So there's a mistake right here just simply in the way they're doing the astronomy. And that right there should tell you there are some errors concerning this particular film here. Well, let me talk a little bit about some things. I want to make 4 general comments about the film. And then I want to look at some specific things about the film. First of all, what is the film charging? What is exactly is the charge here? Well, they want to say that the story of Jesus Christ as presented in the Gospels is a myth. incorporating various aspects of other ancient pagan religions. Now, we have a name for this. We call this the pagan copycat theory. The idea is that Christianity is just a copycat of other religions that are out there. It's not really true. It didn't really happen. The people who originated Christianity, the apostles, whoever they were, and of course these people never claim they know who they are, these people just simply took all these religions and brought them together in some way and created Christianity here. A quote here from Dorothy Murdoch. Dorothy Murdoch, by the way, was a major consultant for this film. She wrote a book called The Christ Conspiracy under a pen name called Acaria S. That was her pen name for that particular book. And she was one of the major consultants, and her book was one of the major sources for the film. She makes this comment. The facts are that major aspects of the Christian myth and ritual can be found in the preceding pre-Christian religions and mythologies of the known world. Moreover, the earlier characters such as Horus, Osiris, Isis, Hercules, Krishna, and many other gods and goddesses cannot be deemed any more mythical or any less historical than Jesus, as the evidence for their existence on earth is as, if not more, abundant and convincing than that of Jesus. Okay, so the charge is, it's just a myth. Now, what's the tactic that they use to be able to argue this particular point? Well, basically, those who hold this view will usually list a number of characteristics of the deities of pagan myths that are parallel to the story of Jesus. That's what you just saw. All those parallels. You know, these, just like what happened to Jesus, that's what happened to Mithra, that's what happened to Dionysius, that's what happened to Krishna. They're all parallels there. Okay? And then claim, of course, that the gospel writers borrowed these parallels from these other religions and compiled them into a myth of Jesus Christ here. What are some of the parallels? Well, some of the ones we saw listed here. He was born of a virgin from a divine father, born on December 25th, or the winter solstice, hailed as a savior by his followers, given royal and divine titles, has 12 disciples, he was baptized, performed miracles, by the way, especially water into wine, that seems to be a favorite, crucified, resurrected after 3 days, and his death and resurrection is celebrated in some sort of ritual meal. And you see this in all these other religions about their gods, so Christianity is just another one of those, is the idea here, okay? It's this idea of using parallels that is the essence of their argument, okay? We sometimes call this parallelism. However, I want to comment here that in 1962, a scholar, a critical scholar by the name of Sandel, actually thought that this kind of arguing became so rampant amongst his people that he came up with a new word, or a new term for this. He called it parallelomania. Okay, which he says, quote, is that extravagance among scholars which first overdoes the supposed similarity in passages, and we're going to see they really do that, okay, and then proceeds to describe source and derivation of the religion as if implying a literary connection flowing in an inevitable or predetermined direction. Parallelomania. What I want to tell you folks is the Zeitgeist movie is parallelomania on steroids. Okay, that's all it is. It's just simply citing a bunch of parallels and saying, see, this is where Christianity came from. Well, some comments that I want to say about this. 4 general comments that I want to make. First of all, I want you to know this is an old idea. There is nothing new here. Many people, when they first see this, wow, I've never heard that before. This must be new research. Not at all, okay? This idea was first propagated back around the late 18th century. It was propagated by a school out of Germany called the Religionisgeschichte-Schule, or the History of Religion School. It came out of one basic university in Germany, basically proposed this idea that, in fact, the idea of religions is that they're all related to each other in some way or another, and they all evolved over time. And Christianity was just a step in the evolution of religions. That was the basic idea behind that. This was a late 19th century theory. It lasted for only a few years, less than half a decade. By the 1930s, it began to die out, and the reason it died out is critical scholars looked at it and said, there's absolutely no evidence to support this at all. None whatsoever. But a bunch of people got on the boat at the time that this was very popular, and they wrote some works on that. And as a matter of fact, many of the sources cited to support the claims in the Zeitgeist movie comes from many of these 19th century sources. In the clip that I showed you, there's 44 citations that they give in the transcript of this clip. 40% of those 44 citations come from these 3 sources. Gerald Massey, who was a 19th century poet and amateur Egyptologist, wrote these 2 works here, and they quote those sources a lot. Massey has been extremely discredited in the conclusions that he's reached there. He wasn't really such a bad Egyptologist. But folks, to be an Egyptologist is not the same thing as to be able to suppose that you can tell me where the origin of Christianity came from. He made a lot of speculations from Egypt, from Horus. We can say this stuff about Jesus, but in fact, none of that is really founded. Okay, Thomas Doane, who wrote Bible Myths and Their Parallels in Other Religions, published in 1882. James Fraser, who wrote a very famous work called The Golden Bough that was very, very popular around the turn of the century. A lot of people read that and really got into that and thought that was great stuff. But again, that book has been pretty much discredited by almost all critical scholars. Almost all of them. There's a very small handful of critical scholars that go along with the Golden Bough in any way whatsoever. As a matter of fact, even Robert Price, who is a critical scholar who thinks there's something to this idea, thinks the Zeitgeist movie got it all wrong. Okay, so even the critical scholars that agree with the basic idea still didn't like the Zeitgeist movie and the support that they got it from here. So it's an old idea, nothing new here. My second point is that there are going to be some similarities between religions. That shouldn't surprise us. I'm going to argue that I don't think these parallels work. But that is not to say that religions don't have some similar things in common. Of course they do. They're all religions. And if they're all religions, they're going to have some commonality to them. Most religions believe in some sort of a godlike figure. Okay? Most religions believe in rites and ceremonies that express that belief. But folks, there's only a limited number of rites and ceremonies you can have. Okay? Many religions incorporate some sort of a meal in the religion. That's not the same thing as saying it's communion. Okay, just because there's a similarity doesn't mean they're the same thing by any means. Okay? Most religions try to deal with the universal human conditions and questions that we all ask as human beings, such as our desire for a ground for meaning, purpose, and value, our struggle with our weaknesses and what we call sin, an answer to evil and suffering. Most religions are going to deal with that because that's the job of religion. Okay, so there is going to be some similarity here. I like what C.S. Lewis says here. C.S. Lewis comments, I could not believe Christianity if I were forced to say that there were 1,000 religions of the world, of which 999 were pure nonsense, and the 1,000th, fortunately, true. My conversion very largely depended on Christianity as the completion, the actualization, the entelechy of something that had never been wholly absent from the mind of men. So there is going to be some similarity. However, similarity does not imply dependence. And that's the charge of the parallelists, the copycatists, that Christianity is dependent upon these pagan religions for their basic beliefs and the story of Jesus here. Now, we need to understand there's two kinds of dependency. Okay, there's what we call weak dependency and strong dependency. Weak dependency is the use of accommodating language or appeals to similar beliefs in order to communicate an idea. Okay, missionaries, for example, still do this today, but we see the example of this in Paul's Mars Hill speech. In his Mars Hill speech of Acts 17, he will use beliefs of his audience as a way of communicating his evidence there. He'll say, the unknown God that you built a statue to, well, I can tell you who that unknown God is. Okay, so he'll use that kind of idea. Missionaries, again, use this today. But that's different than what we call strong dependency. Strong dependency is that the concept originated first in the pagan religion and then in some way or another it was brought into Christianity. And that's the claim, again, of the parallelists. For that, we don't have any evidence at all for. Okay, there's no evidence of any strong dependency of Christian beliefs on pagan religions in the first century. We just don't, there's nothing there to support that. You can assert it, and that's exactly what the parallelists do. They assert it. They're very good at asserting it. But there's a difference between asserting and arguing. Okay, arguing is much more here. The reason we don't have that is, first of all, there's no evidence of pagan mystery religions in first century Palestine. Over and over, if you look at archaeologists, if you look at critical scholars, they'll say, we just don't see this. These pagan religions just don't seem to have been in Palestine. Why? Well, it's very obvious, folks. While mystery religions are highly syncretic, in the sense that they're willing to combine themselves with other religions, that's not the case for Judaism and Christianity. They are both highly, highly exclusivistic. The Jews would never have allowed pagan mystery religions to be in their country. They were extremely exclusivistic. And they certainly, if they were there, they wouldn't borrow from them or make them part of their religion. Same with Christianity. As a matter of fact, Christianity is even more exclusivistic than Judaism is. Christianity says there is only one way to God, and that's through Jesus Christ. No other way will get you there. That's a very exclusivistic religion. All of the pagan mystery religions are syncretic. You could be a member of this pagan mystery religion over here, and you could also be a member of this pagan religion over here, and it doesn't bother them in the least. You can be a member of anything else you want and be a member of our society. They're very accepting of that. That's not true of Christianity and Judaism, and that's one of the reasons why we just don't see pagan religions, mystery religions in Judaism, which is where Christianity originated in the first century. Okay? Now, there is some evidence, and to express some fairness here, there is some evidence that the Christian church did adopt some pagan beliefs probably in the 4th and 5th centuries. It's where we probably got the December 25th date. Probably. We're not sure, but we think that's where it came from. But folks, that's 4th and 5th century. And that's not the origin of Christianity. That's hundreds of years from the origin of Christianity. The parallelist, in order to make their case, has to show that, in fact, there's evidence to show that there was a first century influence on Christianity, okay, that created the myth of the story of Jesus, okay? My third point that I want to make here is that this entire argument, the whole parallelist argument, okay, is actually an example of what we call post hoc ergo propter hoc in philosophy. It's sometimes called the post hoc fallacy or the false cause fallacy. Now, for those of you who are not familiar with these fallacies or logic, okay, the false cause fallacy basically says this, okay, event A occurred before event B, therefore A caused B. In other words, we look at a temporal relationship, this happened before this, and then we make the assertion, therefore this must have caused this. You've heard this kind of stuff before. Maybe you've heard somebody say something like this, I knew it would rain, I just washed my car. As if washing your car actually causes precipitation, okay? Well, of course, nobody really believes that. When we say it, we kind of say it facetiously. We don't really mean that. We're not really asserting a causal connection there, okay, at all. But that's the idea of the false cause fallacy, all right? And my point here is that the fact that a previous religion may have had a similar belief to that of Christianity, and by the way, I'm going to argue that many of the parallels don't work. I'll show you that, okay? But the fact that they had a similar belief does not in itself prove that the previous religion was the cause of the belief in Christianity, okay? You have to argue for a causal chain. You can't just simply assert parallels. That's our parallelomania. Just simply assert a parallel over and over and say, see, that's just like Jesus, so therefore they must have borrowed from that. You need some sort of argument there. Now, by the way, some of these parallelists do try to provide an argument. Let me give you Murdoch, the person I quoted for you before. Let me give you her argument, in a sense, for why there was this parallel that went on here. She says this, in essence, when studying the situation, the scenario that reveals itself is that the creators of the gospel story, in large part, appear to have been scouring the vast library of Alexandria and elsewhere, such as Antioch and Rome, and picking out various attributes of the pre-Christian religion to be used in their creation of a cohesive Christian mythical tale that was later fallaciously set into history and presented to the gullible masses as true story. Now, she provides no evidence for this, okay? Doesn't give you any reason to believe that this is true. She simply asserts it and expects her audience to just simply buy that, okay? Folks, what she's asserting here is that the beginners of Christianity, the Christian authors, intentionally set up a deception, okay? And in fact, the entire Christian world up to this day has been deceived by that. That's a huge assertion to make, an intentional deception, for which she gives absolutely no evidence or argument for it, okay? This is the height of the kind of stuff that oftentimes these copycat theorists will go to, okay? My fourth general comment is that the whole theory rests on the premise that Jesus did not exist at all. In other words, you have to buy that premise before you can buy into what the Zeitgeist movie is saying. If the events of the Gospels occurred in history, then of course this theory completely evaporates. Okay, this is what they say in the movie. We didn't actually see this part of the movie, but this is the comment they make. Once the evidence is weighed, there are very high odds that the figure known as Jesus did not even exist. The reality is Jesus was the solar deity of the Gnostic Christian sect, and like all mother pagan gods, he was a mythical figure. So he didn't even exist at all. Now, why does the Zeitgeist movie have to hold that position? A very, very extreme position, okay? Because every major aspect in the life of Jesus, his birth, his teachings, his baptism, his followers, his miracle, his crucifixion, his resurrection, all of these, they want to claim, are based not on real historical events, but on previous pagan religious myths that were around long before the time of Jesus. Okay? So therefore, there couldn't have been a real Jesus around, because that would say that there were historical events in his life here. No, there were no historical events. All of these are purely based on myths here. However, to make that point, that Jesus didn't exist at all, is to go against a enormous amount of critical scholarship. You like my phrase there? Enormous? It means really big, okay, is the idea here. The vast majority of critical scholars, and when I say vast, folks, I mean vast majority of critical scholars, across all theological spectrums. I'm not just talking about conservatives. I'm talking about conservatives. I'm talking about liberals. I'm talking about extreme radicals. The vast majority of them acknowledge the existence of the historical Jesus and most of the major aspects of his life in some form. Now, they don't all agree. Of course, there's some that deny the resurrection, say, well, I think Jesus existed, but I don't think he was resurrected. And some will say, I don't think he was God, and things like that. But they're all saying he existed, and the basic facts of his life happened. John Dominic Crossan, by no means is John Dominic Crossan a conservative. Far from it. John Dominic Crossan says that the crucifixion of Jesus Christ is the most verifiable historical fact of the ancient world. Okay? Yet, according to the Zeitgeist movie, no, he wasn't really crucified. That's just part of the myth that was added in there. Remember, he's a mythical figure. So they have to be able to deal with this. And the thing is, in the Zeitgeist movie, and for that matter, in many of the writings of them, many copycat theorists, they never really go talk about this vast amount of critical scholarship. They don't deal with it at all. Right now, I'm attending a conference down here in Atlanta, the Evangelical Theological Society, Evangelical Philosophical Society, where we have all these scholars, historical scholars, dealing with the issue of the historical Jesus. We're all talking about Jesus there. We don't all necessarily agree on everything, but we're all talking about the historical Jesus there. And all of these scholars, according to this view, they're all wrong. Okay? And they don't even address them. I think that's a major problem for the view. What I want to do at this point, though, is I actually want to talk about some of the fallacies that are involved. Now, I'm not going to address every claim that's made. I'm not going to do that. I don't have time for that. I refer you to some of the sources I've mentioned there, as well as other places to go to talk about the different claims of here. Mary Jo Sharp, by the way, who's speaking at this conference, did a master's thesis on some of this, and she knows a lot about some of these claims, and you can certainly talk to her about that. She's excellent on this particular area here. What I want to look at is I want to look at the fallacies in the way that they're arguing. Okay, how they're making the case that they're making here. And I'm going to look at a series of fallacies here. And the first one that I want to talk about here is what I call the generalization fallacy. The generalization fallacy. Now, this fallacy basically says it's the combining of ancient religions into one universal model that they all followed. In other words, there were many pagan mystery religions that were going on in the ancient world, okay, around the time just before and just after the birth of Jesus, the life of Jesus, and they continued on until about the 4th, 5th century when they began to die out. Okay, that's when they were happening. They went through certain stages. In the early stages, those mystery religions were pretty much just small pockets throughout the ancient world, okay, around the time of the 1st century A.D., okay. Getting into the 2nd and 3rd century, mostly the 3rd century, they began to reach their peak. They began to be very, very popular in the ancient world around the 3rd century. Then they went through a process of slowly dying out. So about the 4th and 5th century, these pagan mystery religions kind of disappeared here. But it's important to realize that in the 1st century, at least, these were just small little pockets, each of them developing on its own. Okay? Now, they had some similar beliefs. There's no doubt about that. Again, they were all religions. They had that idea here. But there was no universal belief they all copied. There wasn't like there was some sort of art type out there that they all looked at and copied that idea there. That's exactly what astrotheology is claiming in this movie. They're claiming all of them were basically about sun worship. Okay? Not true. Okay, they weren't all about that. They all had different ideas of what was going on. They had similarities. They brought in the vegetative cycle. That was part of it, yes, because they were agrarian. They came basically from agrarian societies. But they weren't all about sun worship or anything like that. Robert Price, one of the few critical scholars that adopts a model like this, comes up with his mythic hero archetype model, where he says there was a mythic hero archetype that all of these religions were basically copying. However, folks, the problem is that's just simply simplistic fiction. Okay? There simply was and is no unified archetype that all the pagan religions followed. They each developed on their own. It's not like there wasn't something out there and we got to follow that one. It's got to be like that. We all have to do that the same. They're all distinct. They're all different from each other. Okay? Copycat theorists, what they do is they usually take aspects from widely different religions and then they force them together into a religion that resembles Christianity. Okay? I think of this something like connecting the dots. Remember when you used to play connect the dots as a little child? You had this page and it had these random dots all over the page there, okay? And you had to connect the dots. But obviously you didn't just simply connect the dots any way you wanted to. If you did that, you'd come up with all sorts of weird things, okay? No, you were given guidance by what? Well, you put numbers or letters or something like that next to the dots, and you followed the numerical sequence around, and pretty soon you drew something like, a train or a house or something like those lines by following the dots around there. In other words, you connected the dots according to some sort of guidance. Well, here's what the copycat theorists do. They basically set up a game of connect the dots. They pull things out of all these pagan religions, okay, but they only pull out the stuff that looks like what's guiding them. What's guiding them? The life of Jesus. They look at the life of Jesus and say, oh, look, that's like that. So, oh, look, that's like that too. And, we'll put that there too. Then they connect the dots and they marvel. Wow, it looks like Jesus. Well, of course it looks like Jesus. That was their model for how they set the dots up. There's a lot of things in these religions they're not pulling out. They're not talking about. That aren't anything like what Jesus was like or like what Christianity is like. They're not touching that stuff. Why? Because it doesn't look like Jesus. Okay, so it's kind of a connect the dots type system that they use here, okay, in many ways here. That's the generalization fallacy. I think the most blatant fallacy is the second one, which is the terminology fallacy. The terminology fallacy basically does this. Events in the lives of the mythical gods are expressed using Christian terminology in order subtly to manipulate viewers into accepting that the same events in the life of Jesus also happen in the lives of other mythical gods. This really bothers me. For example, in the movie they talked about, the Messiah solar god. Okay, well, Messiah, what's that? Messiah is a distinctly Hebrew term, okay, to talk about the Savior that God would send for Israel. I mean, why are we talking about Horus being a Messiah? Well, because you know why? You all know what Messiah is. Well, that's Horus. Okay, and that's what they want to use Christian terminology to manipulate you to believing that this stuff happened here. Okay, baptism. What's baptism? Well, baptism was originally a Jewish practice that Christians adopted, okay? But you don't find baptism in other religions, okay? But we'll talk about any time water is introduced, like I love what they do with Horus and Osiris being thrown into the Nile. Oh, that was Osiris in the Nile? That was his baptism. Why? Water. Oh, I'm not sure that's really a baptism there. Okay, that's the kind of stuff they do here. Now, I can't look at all of the examples here, but I want to look at three of the most common examples that I find, at least when I look at this. First of all, the idea that they were all born of a virgin. You heard this on the film. Born of a virgin. Horus, born of a virgin. Krishna, born of a virgin. Attis, born of a virgin. They're all born of a virgin. I say, well, are these really virginal births, at least in the same way we mean when we talk about Jesus? Not really. Let's take a look at just some of them real quickly here. Horus. Where did Horus come from? Well, there's several different stories. You need to understand that the story of Horus is probably one of the most complex and difficult stories for us to understand. The Horus myth is a myth that developed over 3,000 years from several different texts. You have the coffin text, you have the pyramid text, you have the Egyptian Book of the Dead. They all have stuff about Horus, many of them contradicting one another. Many of them saying certain things happened to Horus, and the other one says something else happened to Horus. So, for example, we have several different versions of Horus's conception. But the most common story of where Horus came from, okay, he was the conception of two gods, Osiris and Iris. Osiris was a god that was killed by Set. Okay, Set cut him up into 14 pieces, okay, and buried the pieces all over Egypt. Okay, Osiris's wife, Iris, and by the way, Iris is described as his wife, so I think we can assume she wasn't a virgin. Okay, Osiris's wife goes around, collects all the parts of Osiris together, but she can't find one part. Okay, 14 parts, she can only find 13 of them. Okay, and the part she can't find is his penis. Okay, so she creates a penis out of wood, a wooden phallus, okay, which she has sexual relations with Horus. Okay, virginal conception, virginal birth? I don't think so. That's not what's really going on here, okay? How about Attis? We're told Attis was born of a virgin. Well, not quite, okay? What happened with Attis was this. Zeus, the great Greek god Zeus, okay, Zeus, excuse the crudeness here, but this is what it is. Zeus masturbates and spills his seed onto a mountain, okay? His seed becomes a pomegranate tree. Nana, okay, the mother of Attis, is sitting under the pomegranate tree when an apple drops into her lap. Conception. Okay? That's where Attis comes from. Not exactly the same thing as what's going on with Jesus here. Okay? Krishna. It's claimed Krishna was conceived. Okay? But actually, folks, any sources we have of Krishna being virginally conceived come from about the 7th century, 700 years after Jesus. Okay? We're getting the story about, actually, what we're told is Devaki had 7 children before Krishna. Hardly a virgin. Okay, at that point. So we don't really have the virginal conceptions. Why do they say that? Well, because they want to make it sound, like it's like Jesus. Okay, so they use that. Another example, crucifixion. We're told that many of these gods were crucified. Really? Were they? Well, what exactly do we have here? Well, Krishna, the earlier sources tell us, was shot in the heel by an arrow. Okay, not crucified. All right? Attis, at one point in his life, castrates himself, flees into the woods, and dies. Not a crucifixion. Okay? Horus? Well, it depends. It depends upon which version of the Horus myth you go with. There are so many different versions out there. One version tells us he never died. Another version tells us that he died by being stung by a scorpion. In other versions, his death is conflated with Osiris. One of the problems with the Horus myth is that oftentimes Horus and Osiris are conflated together, so we're not sure if they're talking about Osiris, Horus, whether the same person, different persons. That's a very common thing in Egyptian religion. In Egyptian religion, people take on the other god's identity as their life goes on, so it's kind of hard to say that. So sometimes his death is conflated with the death of Osiris. Now you might wonder, with all these different deaths here, how can they say that these gods were crucified? How can they make that claim? Well, let me give an example here. And again, I'm going to quote from Dorothy Murdoch, who is the major consultant for this particular film. This is what Murdoch says. When it is asserted that Horus, or Osiris, was crucified, it should be kept in mind that it was not part of the Horus-Osiris myth that the murdered god was actually held down and nailed on a cross. Egyptian deities, including Horus, were depicted in cruciform with their arms extended or outstretched. Now, by the way, saying they were depicted in cruciform, she's already trying to manipulate you. What they are is they're depicted with their arms out. That's all. They just have their arms out like this. Okay, most Egyptologists will tell you because Horus was the sky god and the arms being out was suspending the sky. Okay, that's usually what it was there. But no, she wants to call it in cruciform, okay, as in various images that are comparable to crucifixes. So in other words, Murdoch will tell you, look, we're not saying these people were really crucified. We're just saying that anytime they stretch their arms out, we can say they were crucified. Okay, and that's exactly what they do here. Again, hardly a crucifixion, okay? What about resurrection? We're told all these gods resurrected from the dead. Really? Okay, well, let's again look at the original sources of the gods here. Horus, there's an interesting thing that happened to him after his death. Okay, he became lord of the underworld. Okay, by the way, that's Osiris, Horus combined. Okay, because again, they conflate them. He became lord of the underworld. Never came back to this world. Never came back to life in this world. He's lord of the underworld there. But that's like a crucifixion. That's like a resurrection, right? He's still alive, okay, as the copycat saith. Attis eventually was turned into a pine tree, okay? Okay, I guess he's kind of back in this world, but not exactly resurrected, okay? Krishna, well, earliest tradition says that he returned to the spirit world. Now, again, if we go later on, in the 4th or 5th century, we learn that there was a teaching that Krishna was resurrected, but that's 4th or 5th century, okay, after Christianity has been well formulated here, okay, at that particular point here. All right, Jonathan Smith, who wrote the article on dying and rising deities in the Encyclopedia of Religion, makes this comment. All of the deities that have been identified as belonging to the class of dying and rising deities, which are these pagan gods, okay, can be subsumed under the two larger classes of disappearing deities or dying deities. In the first case, the deities return, but they never died. In the second case, they die, but they do not return. There is no unambiguous instance in the history of religions of a dying and rising deity. He's talking about that history of religious movement that we're talking about there. He's not talking about Christianity. He says there's simply no evidence of that at all. We just simply don't have that dying and rising deity evidence there. Okay? So it's simply not there at all. All right, my next fallacy that I want to mention is what I call the biblical fallacy. And the biblical fallacy is simply this. Copycat theorists often make claims about the life of Jesus that are not based on the gospel accounts, but they originate from other sources. And this is one of the things, hopefully, when you're watching the movie up here, you kind of thought, wait a second, okay, that's not even in the Bible, which is right. It's not. For example, the December 24th date. December 25th date, excuse me. How often in the movie did they emphasize that these gods, born on December 25th? Why do they do that? Well, because we celebrate Jesus' birth on December 25th. But folks, the Gospels don't tell us anything about when Jesus was born. We don't know. We have no idea when it was. In the first century, we just don't have any first century evidence from any first century source as the exact date of Jesus' birth. We're not sure when it was. We can speculate, and there's been lots of arguments. Some argue that it was probably not in the winter, because the shepherds would not be out with their sheep at night in the wintertime. There was probably more in the spring. But the point is, we really don't know when that was here, okay? When did the 25th date come about? About the 5th century. That's when the Christian church started to actually adopt and pick a particular date. And there is some evidence, as I suggested earlier, that they may have picked that date because of pagan religions. Okay, I'm not going to deny that the church probably was influenced by pagan religions in the 5th century. I am going to argue that it wasn't influenced by pagan religions in the 1st century, which is the century when Christianity actually came about and was developed at that particular time. Okay, another example are the three kings. Okay, which we saw pictured here. You know, all the stuff about three kings coming to worship him. And by the way, if you go back to the Horus story where he talks about three kings, there is absolutely nothing in the Horus myth at all about three kings coming to worship Horus. There's nothing. We don't find it. It's just pure speculation. Murdoch, who has a chapter on this in her book, Christ and Horus, the Christ-Horus myth, she pulls from all sorts of strange speculative ideas to create this idea, but there's no evidence of that. But even if there is, okay, there's no three kings at the birth of Jesus. That's a nice song. We all sing it. We three kings of Orient are. Okay, but go to the Gospels, folks. The Gospels don't tell us that they were kings. They never use that word. They don't tell us how many there were. We don't know. Okay, there's no three anywhere there. We speculate because of the idea that three gifts are listed. We kind of speculate maybe there were three kings, one for each gift. But hey, it could be two kings and one brought two, okay, or something like that. We don't know, okay? We're told they're magi. Magi are not kings. Magi are priests in the Zoroastrian religion, okay? So they're not kings at all. I mean, but they make a big point of wanting to bring the kings out, okay? And again, Murdoch actually defends this by saying, well, we know that the Gospels don't tell us that, but Christians have believed it. Tell most Christians that, they'll be so surprised. They believe this for a long time. So therefore, there's definite parallel there. Well, again, we're talking about original sources, not about what people falsely believe, okay? And by the way, if you believe that, you're wrong, okay? The Gospels don't tell us that. Maybe they were, maybe they weren't. And by the way, the time when they came, the kings, Jesus was probably about 3 years old when they came, okay, at that particular point. If you look at the Gospel accounts, what's going on there, it wasn't the infant. We have this idea that they were at the manger. Probably not, okay, at that point. We won't get into that. It's a whole other discussion, right? My next fallacy is what I call the chronological fallacy. How am I doing time-wise? Okay, good. The chronological fallacy says that in order for the copycat charge to succeed, one must provide evidence that the parallel chronologically preceded the writing of the Gospels and the New Testament epistles, which were all written in the first century AD. In other words, for this to work, of course, you have to have evidence that, in fact, these teachings, these ideas, were around before first century AD, so that the early Christians could borrow from them and create their myth about Jesus, okay? Do we have that kind of evidence? No, we don't, okay? There's no evidence of any pagan mystery influence in the first century Palestine, as I said earlier. So we don't see it there at all here. The mystery religions evolved and changed over time, and as they did, their beliefs and practices and narratives changed. Okay? We need to understand that the pagan mystery religions aren't something you can go to and find an authoritative source and say this is what they believe. Unfortunately, there was no authoritative source for many of these religions. Okay? We find out about them usually from other sources. Okay? Or the sources that we have are just simply so broad that we don't know what they meant. Okay? But they evolved over time. Okay? As the theory went on here. Okay? So what we know about them later on may not necessarily what was true about them earlier here. And most of the evidence we have of the mystery religions comes from the 2nd and 3rd century, okay, when they were at their peak. We do have evidence concerning them. But we have very, very little information of what these mystery religions were like during the 1st century. And because they evolved so much, you simply can't take the fallacious step that because they believe something in the 3rd century, they must have also believed that in the 1st century. Okay? In fact, we have evidence, just the contrary, that in the 3rd century, many of these pagan mystery religions may have been adopting their beliefs from Christianity. Okay, we have that as well here. Now, some claims by Zeitgeist come from even later sources. For example, the claims that Krishna was born of a virgin cannot be found in any source prior to the 7th century. And most scholars believe that the Hindus borrowed the story from Christianity, not the other way around. Okay? Well, while there is evidence of Christianity employing some aspects of the mystery religions, as I mentioned, late, 4th or 5th century, evidence of borrowing earlier than the 3rd century suggests that the mystery religions may have borrowed actually from Christianity. One of the mystery religions believed in something called the Toraborium. The Toraborium was where a bull was basically sacrificed, and the person who it was sacrificed for would stand underneath the bull, and the blood would pour down on that person. Okay, the idea being cleansed by the blood. Okay, well, you can say, that's a Christian type of idea. Yeah, but the Toraborium practice we don't have any evidence of it before 3rd century. It seems to have begun sometime in the 3rd century, and many scholars believe that, in fact, that mystery religion borrowed the idea of being saved by the blood from Christian teachings. And that's where it came from, rather than the other way around here. Okay, so chronologically, we just simply don't have the evidence to support that, in fact, any of these teachings were earlier than the Christian teaching there. Especially the dying and rising gods motif, which was one of the strongest motifs that the religion Geschichte school wanted to support, is that we have all of these dying and rising God ideas that were pre-Christian. We don't have any evidence of that at all. Okay, all the evidence comes from post-Christian, not pre-Christian. Okay? The source fallacy. Okay? Obviously, if you're going to make these kinds of claims, you need to have good sources to depend upon them. Okay, and it's often, supporters of the movie often talk about how well documented it is. And when I go online and I read people who've seen this movie, they all say, oh, this is so well documented. Go to the transcript and look at the transcript. It's so well documented, all of these teachings. Well, it is. It's got a lot of documentation. In the 7-minute clip that we watched, there are 44 citations in the transcript for the statements that they're making there, okay, from 18 different sources. Now, that's pretty good documentation, you might say. That's a lot, okay? But almost any critical scholar will tell you it's not the quantity of the documentation that makes a difference, it's the quality of the documentation that makes a difference. I can give you a lot of documentation for something, but am I giving it from good sources? Okay, reliable sources, academic sources, primary sources. No, that's not what's happening here at all. Not one of these 18 sources is a primary source. Okay, comes from an actual religious text. Nobody quotes the coffin text or the pyramid text, as I mentioned on Horus. Okay, not at all. Okay, they're all secondary sources. Okay, and most of the secondary sources are scholars that have been discredited or abandoned long ago by critical scholars. Okay, they've looked at these people and said, "I'm sorry, these people really, they're not qualified, or they're arguing another thing." Or oftentimes, what these sources do is they quote just simply other sources. They'll quote some other source that supports their idea, okay, and they won't quote a primary source. They go to a primary source to quote their idea here. These sources often make undocumented assertions. Okay, they just assert something with actually no evidence for it. Very, very common to find that. They speculate on causal relationships. That's one of the most common things you'll see. This must have caused this to happen. Why? Well, because they looked similar, and that's what causes them. That's that false cause analogy there. One of my favorites in the movie is where, at a certain point, they talk about how Virgo, the constellation Virgo, okay, that Mary was actually based on the constellation Virgo because the symbol for the constellation Virgo looks like an M. And that's why we have Mary, the Virgin Mary, and Isis Mary. They talk about Isis Mary, the Virgin Isis Mary. By the way, calling her Isis Mary is really misleading because every Egyptian deity at one point or another is called that Mary. So you have Osiris Mary. Mary just simply means beloved. Okay, that's all it means. But putting Isis Mary there, what's it going to make you think? Virgin Mary. Okay, that's the idea. That's why they do that. They're manipulating you through the language that they're using there. Okay. But in this particular example that I was talking about here, the letter M formulates the constellation Virgo. So, Virgo, that's where they got the Virgin Mary from. Okay, because why? Because M. Okay, now they're asserting a causal relationship. They're saying the constellation symbol was the cause of the name Mary for the mother of Jesus. Okay, do they give you any evidence for it? None. Okay, they just assert it. That's where it came from. Well, thank you very much, but I'd like to see some argument or some evidence to show me that's where it came from. Okay, that they don't give you. They offer selective interpretations of some texts. Okay, they will oftentimes quote a text, but then they'll interpret that text for you without letting you know that there's a lot of unrevealed disagreement about what that text means. Okay, but they'll tell you, oh no, this is what it means. Okay, why? It fits their purposes. But many other scholars disagree. Okay, translating Egyptian, for example, is extremely difficult. It's very, very difficult to do. Okay, and scholars often disagree on what the translation exactly meant there in that case, okay? Often the authors are not experts in the field of religion or are experts in a related field like Egyptology, and they're not qualified to comment on the origin of Christianity at all. Okay, they simply don't have that kind of qualification. They may be qualified in some other field. Murdoch's, for example, in her Horus Christ book, she quotes a lot of sources that are maybe great sources on ancient Egyptian religion. Okay, I don't doubt that. The guy probably knows that. Okay, but that doesn't mean now he can speculate on ancient Egyptian religion and its relationship to the origin of Christianity. That's a whole different argument there. Okay, at that particular point. But that's what she'll do. Well, this guy says this, so therefore this must be true. You can't make that kind of an argument go there. And the reason they do this, folks, they use that is there's a real problem with choosing primary sources for these ancient pagan religions. Oftentimes, there's no single authoritative primary source to appeal to. Okay, like in the Isis-Osiris myth and Horus, which is a 3,000-year-old myth, and we don't have any one authority. It's not like our Bible. We go to the Bible, that's kind of our authority to what happened with Jesus. We have 4 gospel accounts that are very parallel with each other, and we can say, well, this is what happened because the gospel tells us. They don't have that, these pagan religions. Mithraism, one of the great pagan religions they mentioned in the scriptures here, doesn't have any writings. You know where we get our information from Mithraism? 3 reliefs. A relief is just like a stone carving on the side of a wall. That's where we get all our information about Mithraism. We don't have writings for it. And of course, you've got to interpret reliefs. And it's the interpretations that need to be questioned here. Okay? They must play connect the dots. And when you play connect the dots, folks, that means you select which dots you're going to use to make your picture. And that's exactly what they do. Okay, they select that way. Okay. My final fallacy that I want to mention is what I call the difference fallacy. The difference fallacy is where the copycat theorists overemphasize the supposed similarities, as I tried to show you through the language that they use, the terminology that they use, the comments that they make. They overemphasize the similarities, and they ignore enormous substantive and relative differences between these religions. And that's one of the things that should bother us the most, okay, is they give you the idea that all these religions were basically all saying the same thing, and that's simply not true. Especially the pagan religions in comparison to Christianity. There are some tremendous differences that aren't commented at all by these authors and by the copycat theorists. The purpose and nature of the pagan mystery religions is completely different than the purpose and nature of Christianity. Okay? Huge differences. Examples, mystery religions are cyclical. Okay? They generally follow the cycle of birth, death, and rebirth ad infinitum, meaning it never ends, following basically the vegetative harvest circles, because they were agrarian types of religions. Okay? Christianity is not like that at all. Christianity is linear. It views all of history as heading towards a specific direction, towards a specific goal. It's not cyclical. Okay? Mystery religions involve secrecy. Only members can participate in them. Okay, if you had to become a member and you were the only one who could participate in the ceremonies and rites of that particular religion, to become a member you had to go through secret initiation rites. Matter of fact, that's one of the reasons why we don't know much about these mystery religions, especially the first century, because they were secret. Okay, and this was secret knowledge that you had to have. Okay, Christianity, completely open. It has no secretiveness to it at all. There are no secret rites. There's no secret knowledge. It's completely open. Okay, mystery religions, doctrines, and beliefs were really unimportant. They were religions of emotions. They were the idea of having some sort of mystical, emotional experience. That was the idea basically behind them. They weren't religions of doctrines or beliefs that you had to hold here. Okay? It was the emphasis as well on the mystical experience. However, for Christianity, doctrine and beliefs are important. They're the heart of Christianity. What you believe is the most important thing about it, not the emotional experience you have. Now, great, you have an emotional experience. That's wonderful. And I'm not discounting necessary Christian mystical experiences. But the heart is belief and what you believe. That wasn't the heart of the mystery religions. That's why they were so syncretic. It didn't matter what you believed. You could still become a member of our religion. Okay? That's not true of Christianity at all. Okay? Mystery religions were void of any ethical element. We don't see anything teaching about living righteousness or the way you live or ethics or anything like that in the mystery religions. Christianity involves moral teachings and places a strong emphasis on living a righteous life. I mean, that's why Jesus died, so that we could be like him, okay, and have righteousness. We just don't see that. Mystery religions were not interested in the historicity of its myth and often acknowledged myths as non-historical. The mystery religions themselves said that these are myths, that they weren't history, they didn't really happen. Christianity is wrapped up in its history. It's totally historical. If the events didn't actually occur, Christianity makes no sense as a religion. It only makes sense if the fact that Jesus Christ really came on this earth, really walked, really taught the things that he did, really performed the acts that he did, really was crucified, really rose from the dead. Those things really had to happen in order for Christianity to make sense. If that stuff did not happen, then Christianity just makes no sense at all. Okay? That's not true of the mystery religions. They recognize they're all mythical. And finally, my last comparison I want to make between these is, most importantly, the meaning and purpose of the death of Jesus is completely different than the death of the mystery religions' gods. In the mystery religions, yes, their gods die. Okay, they do die, there's no doubt about it. But the meaning and what's happening there is so different from Christianity. Christ died for the sins of mankind. He died for us. Okay, none of the pagan gods died for anyone else at all. They didn't die for somebody. Okay, actually, they died under compulsion. Most of them were murdered in some way or another, something like that. Jesus died willingly. Okay, Jesus died and was raised once. The pagan gods die cyclically, along with the vegetative cycle. Jesus' death was not tragic or defeat. It was a victory for us. Pagans, they mourn and lament the death of God. They treat it as a memorial when that happens there. So there are tremendous differences between Christianity and the pagan religions that the copycat theorists just simply ignore. They don't pay any attention to them at all. All they want to show you is those parallels, and many of them are forced through the language that they use and the things that they do there. Travel with me, if you would, please, 2,000 years into the future. We're 2,000 years now from now, okay? After a cataclysmic event has occurred in this world, let's say World War III, some sort of huge event occurred here, and only a handful of documents of the past are available concerning the 20th century. A small group of believers get together, a small group of people get together, and they formulate this belief, okay? The life of John F. Kennedy is a myth, okay, based upon the Lincoln myth. And you say, how do they do that? Parallels. Look at the parallels, okay? Lincoln was elected to Congress in 1846. Kennedy was elected to Congress in 1946. Ooh. Lincoln was elected president in 1860. Kennedy was elected president in 1960. Wow. Lincoln and Kennedy each have 7 letters in their names. Man. That's amazing. Okay? Lincoln had a secretary named Kennedy. Kennedy had a secretary named Lincoln. Ooh. By the way, not true. Kennedy, not, hey, but what the heck? Neither is half the stuff the parallels say either. So, I mean, if they can do it, so can I. And that's my point here. I'm doing the same thing they're doing, okay, at that particular point here. Both married in their 30s to a 25-year-old socially prominent girl who could speak fluent French. Wow. Okay. Both presidents dealt with civil rights movements for African Americans. Okay, well, kind of dealt with. Kennedy, well, kind of. Okay. Both presidents were assassinated, okay, on a Friday in the back of the head before a major holiday while sitting next to their wives by assassins known by 3 names consisting of 15 letters each. Oswald shot Kennedy from a warehouse and was captured in a theater. Booth shot Lincoln in a theater and was captured in a warehouse. Well, kind of a warehouse. But you know, it's like a warehouse. Both assassins were shot and killed with a Colt revolver days after they assassinated the president and before they could be brought to trial. Both presidents were succeeded by vice presidents named Johnson, born in 1808 and 1908, respectively. Wow. You know what? Kennedy didn't really exist. He's just a myth that was fabricated on the Lincoln myth. Okay? Why can't I do that? Okay? I got all these parallels. As long as I have these parallels, I should be able to do that, because that's exactly what the copycat theorists are doing. They find a bunch of parallels, selectively find them, change some of the wording around, barn to warehouse, they do some of that stuff, and they come up with a theory that Jesus Christ, the Christian theory, was based on earlier myths. Okay? I'm going to close with a quote. Okay, the quote's by Adolf von Harnack. Oh, I'm sorry, before I make my quote, let me make summary comments here. First of all, many of the claims about the ancient religions themselves are dubious. Many of them are dubious. Okay, like I said, the stuff you saw listed there, the 3 kings, things like that, we have no evidence for that stuff for Horus or for any of these guys at all. Some of it's just simply made up, or they take something and interpret it in that way. The vast majority of the claimed parallels simply are not there once one examines the original sources that we actually have there. We just don't see these. They're forced to fit through the language that's used. Okay, very common. Just because there may be some parallels, and there's some similarities, that's no evidence itself of strong dependence. You got to show that. You got to argue that. You can't just simply say, oh, look, there's a parallel, therefore they're dependent on one another. Mystery religions do not claim historicity. Christianity does. That's, I think, a major aspect of it. There is no evidence of a strong dependency of the Christian narrative or doctrines on other religions. None. We don't see that at all there. Okay? And the non-syncretic nature of Judaism and Christianity is strong evidence against the borrowing from pagan religions, folks. They just didn't do that. Okay? It was considered an anathema for you to do that kind of stuff in early Christianity, okay, to borrow from those religions. Let me give my quote here. This is from Adolf von Harnack. Harnack wrote this particular quote back in 1911. Look at how much it applies to the Zeitgeist movie. We must reject the comparative mythology which finds a causal connection between everything and everything else, which tears down solid barriers, bridges chasms as though it were child's play, and spins combinations from superficial similarities. By such methods, one can turn Christ into a sun god in the twinkling of an eye, or transform the apostles into the 12 months. In connection with Christ's nativity, one can bring up the legends attending the birth of every conceivable god, or one can catch all sorts of mythological doves to keep company with the baptismal dove, or find any number of celebrated asses to follow the ass on which Jesus rode into Jerusalem. And thus, with the magic wand of comparative religion, or parallelism, okay, triumphantly eliminate every spontaneous trait in any religion. Folks, if you can do that, you can claim just about anything. Okay? Watch out for what the internet tells you. Check it out. Don't just simply believe it because it looks good. Okay? I think we have time. We're out of time. We just ran out of time here. And I'm sorry we don't have time for questions here, folks. If you do have any questions, I'm here afterwards. I'll be glad to talk to you afterwards here. Thank you very much for coming. I hope this was helpful to you.